I should have known something was wrong the moment her message came in, smiling like nothing had changed. "Calm down, Ethan, I'll be back in a week," it said, and for a second I just stared at it like it belonged to someone else, like maybe if I didn't move it wouldn't become real. The screen lit up my kitchen in that cold blue glow, and behind the words was the photo she didn't mean to send, or maybe she did. Olivia standing under the departure board at JFK, a small carry-on at her side, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, and next to her Ryan Blake, her ex, the man she once told me was a closed chapter, a mistake she'd outgrown. He wasn't touching her, not exactly, but he was close enough that I could feel the space between them wasn't mine anymore, and that was the moment something inside me didn't break, it didn't explode, it didn't even hurt, not the way people expect. It just went quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in your chest when your brain decides it's done arguing with reality. I didn't call, I didn't text back, I didn't ask what the hell she thought she was doing. I just set my phone down on the counter next to a half-empty coffee mug that had gone cold hours ago, and leaned back against the sink like I was watching someone else's life play out on a screen, because the truth is, by the time Olivia boarded that flight to Paris, I was already past the point of shock, past anger. Even what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this story didn't start at the airport. It started weeks earlier, in smaller, quieter moments, the kind you almost ignore. The way she started placing her phone face down, the way her laughter changed when she was texting someone late at night, the way she stopped asking how my day was and started telling me less about hers. It was subtle at first, like a draft you feel before you notice the window is open, but once you feel it you can't unfeel it. And I remember standing in the same kitchen one night, staring at her across the counter while she scrolled through something that made her smile, a smile I hadn't seen in months, and realizing I wasn't part of that moment at all. I didn't confront her then either. I didn't accuse or demand answers, because something about it felt bigger than a single conversation, bigger than a fight you could win or lose. It felt like a shift, like the ground under a house starting to move before the cracks show up in the walls. So instead of reacting, I started paying attention. I started noticing patterns, timing, little inconsistencies that didn't line up, and the more I noticed, the quieter I became, not out of weakness, but because noise would have ruined what I was beginning to understand. Olivia thought she was stepping out of our life for a week. She thought this was a secret, a harmless escape, something she could control with a few soft words and a casual text. But standing there in my kitchen with her message glowing on my phone, I realized something she hadn't even considered. She wasn't the only one who had been preparing for what came next, and when I finally picked up my phone again, it wasn't to ask questions, it wasn't to beg or to argue, it was to take a breath, steady and slow, and accept a truth that felt heavier than anything she could have said. Paris wasn't the beginning of the story, it was just where she decided to walk into the part she thought she understood. I did not sleep that night, not because I was angry, but because my mind refused to slow down. It kept replaying every small moment I had ignored, every late night message, every quiet smile that did not belong to me. And the strange thing was, the more I thought about it, the less emotional it felt, like I was stepping back from my own life and watching it from a distance, like a man reviewing footage after something already happened. By 3 a.m, I was sitting at the dining table with my laptop open, the house completely still, the kind of silence that makes even the hum of the refrigerator sound loud. I opened the flight confirmation I had quietly forwarded to myself 2 days earlier when I first saw the notification pop up on her screen. Paris 1 week round trip, 2 tickets. Not one. I remember staring at that detail for a long time, not reacting, just letting it settle, because that was the moment I stopped telling myself stories about misunderstandings. People do not accidentally book 2 tickets across the Atlantic, and they do not accidentally choose the same man they once promised to leave behind. I did not need to guess anymore. I already knew, and knowing changes everything. It strips away the urge to argue, to demand explanations, because explanations do not matter once the truth is clear. What matters is what you do with it. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the house, the place I had spent years building inch by inch, the mortgage payments, the weekends fixing things that broke, the quiet routines that make a life feel stable. And I realized something uncomfortable. Olivia had been treating this life like something temporary, like something she could step away from and come back to whenever she felt like it. But for me, it was never temporary, it was everything. And that difference right there was the gap I could no longer ignore. Around 4:30 in the morning, I made coffee, not because I needed it, but because it gave my hands something to do. I stood by the window watching the streetlights fade as the sky started to lighten, and I made a decision that felt strangely calm. I was not going to chase her. I was not going to send messages or ask where she was or who she was with. I was not going to play the role she had already written for me, the confused husband waiting at home. Instead, I was going to move forward quietly, deliberately in a way she would not see coming. I picked up my phone and scrolled back to her message again, the words still sitting there like they carried no weight. Calm down, I will be back in a week. I read it twice, then locked the screen, because by the time she stepped off that plane again, nothing would be the same, and she would not understand why not at first, because from her side this was just a trip, just a week, just something she could explain away, but from mine it was the moment everything shifted, and once something shifts at that level, it does not shift back the same way. I finished my coffee, washed the mug, and set it in the rack like any other morning, but there was nothing normal about what came next, because while Olivia was somewhere over the Atlantic believing she had time, I was already beginning to take it away piece by piece, without a single raised voice, without a single warning, just quiet decisions stacking on top of each other until there would be nothing left for her to return to. By the time the sun came up, I was already moving, not fast, not reckless, just deliberate, like someone following a plan that had been forming long before it needed to be used. I drove to the bank a little after 9, the same branch Olivia and I had opened our joint accounts at years ago, the same place where we had once sat side by side talking about savings goals and future plans like they were permanent things. The woman at the counter recognized me, smiled, asked how I was doing, and I returned the smile like nothing in my world had shifted, because from the outside it had not. I asked to speak with a manager, and when I sat down in that glass office, I kept my voice calm, steady, the way you do when you are not asking for permission but simply executing a decision. I explained that I wanted to separate certain accounts, restructure access, adjust permissions. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just a quiet reorganization of what was mine and what no longer needed to be shared. The manager nodded, asked a few routine questions, and within an hour everything was in motion. Notifications would not go out immediately. There were delays built into systems like this, delays that gave me time. And that time mattered more than anything, because timing is control, and control was the one thing Olivia believed she had. When she boarded that plane after the bank, I drove to the office, even though I did not need to be there. I just needed somewhere familiar, somewhere that still operated on logic and order. I sat at my desk and opened my email, scrolling through messages that suddenly felt distant, like they belonged to a version of me that had not yet seen what I had seen the night before. I pulled up a folder I had created weeks ago, nothing obvious, nothing labeled in a way that would draw attention, just a collection of documents, screenshots, small pieces of information that on their own meant very little but together told a complete story. I remembered the first time I saved something into that folder. It felt almost ridiculous, like I was overthinking a situation that probably had a simple explanation, but I saved it anyway, just in case. And then there was another and another, until just in case became a pattern, and patterns do not lie. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath, not heavy, not emotional, just measured, because what I was doing now was not about reacting to one message or one trip. This was about acknowledging a reality that had been building quietly for a long time. Olivia thought she had a week. She thought she could leave, step into another version of her life, and then come back and resume the one she left behind. But what she never understood was that you cannot pause a life and expect it to wait exactly where you left it, especially when the other person inside that life has already started moving forward. I checked my phone once around noon. No new messages, no missed calls, just silence from her side, which made sense. She was probably landing around that time, stepping into a different city, a different atmosphere, a different version of herself, one where I was not present at all, and that was fine, because I did not need to be there anymore, not physically, not emotionally, not even in the background. I closed my laptop, gathered my things, and left the office earlier than usual. The day felt longer than it actually was, like time had stretched just enough to give me room to think and act without pressure. And as I drove home, I realized something simple but important. This was not about taking something from her, this was about reclaiming what I had already given too freely, and by the time she would finally look back and realize something was different, it would already be too late to stop it. I got home just before sunset, and for a moment I sat in the driveway with the engine off, watching the house like it belonged to someone else. The same porch light, the same curtains drawn halfway, the same quiet street where nothing ever seemed to change, and yet everything had already shifted in a way that could not be undone. I stepped inside, and the air felt exactly the same as it always had, faint trace of her perfume still lingering somewhere between the hallway and the living room, a detail I would have ignored any other day, but now it stood out like evidence of a version of her that no longer existed. I walked through each room slowly, not searching for anything specific, just observing, like I was taking inventory of a life I had built piece by piece over the years. The couch we picked Out after arguing for 2 weekends straight, the dining table we barely used except on holidays, the framed photos on the wall that told a story of two people who once believed they were building something permanent. I stopped in front of one of those photos, a beach trip from 3 summers ago, Olivia laughing at something outside the frame, sunlight hitting her hair just right, the kind of moment that looks effortless but takes years of shared life to create, and I realized something uncomfortable. That version of her was gone long before she boarded that flight. She did not disappear overnight, she faded gradually in ways I chose not to confront at the time, because confronting it would have meant admitting something was already broken. I moved into the bedroom and opened her closet, the hangers spaced neatly, her clothes organized the way she always kept them, as if order could control everything else in her life. But there were gaps now, small ones that only someone who lived there would notice. Missing pieces that matched the suitcase I saw in that photo at the airport. I reached up to the top shelf and pulled down a small box where we kept old documents, passports, copies of important records, things people hold on to because they represent stability. I opened it and flipped through the contents slowly. Birth certificates, insurance papers, joint agreements, signatures side by side across pages that once meant unity but now felt like lines drawn in sand. I set the box down on the bed and sat there for a moment, not overwhelmed, not angry, just clear in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. Clarity has a weight to it, not heavy like emotion, but steady like something you cannot ignore once you see it. I stood up, walked over to the dresser, and opened the drawer where we kept spare keys. Inside was a small envelope I had placed there weeks earlier, something simple, something intentional. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand, and for the first time that day I allowed myself a small breath that felt close to resolve, because everything I was doing, everything I had been preparing was not random, it was structured, it had a direction, and more importantly, it had an end point. Olivia believed she had control over how this story would unfold. She thought she could leave, come back, and decide what to say, what to explain, what to keep, and what to discard. But control does not belong to the person who leaves, it belongs to the person who stays and chooses what remains when they are gone. I placed the envelope back exactly where it had been, closed the drawer, and walked out of the bedroom, turning off the light behind me. As I moved through the house, the silence no longer felt empty, it felt settled, like a decision had already been made, even if the final step had not yet happened. And somewhere across the ocean, Olivia was stepping into a version of her life that felt free and temporary, while here everything she assumed would be waiting for her was quietly being rewritten, without a single word spoken, without a single warning, just the slow, deliberate shift of a man who no longer needed answers because he already had them. The next morning started like any other, except nothing in it belonged to the life I used to recognize. I woke up at the same time, 6:30, out of habit, the alarm barely finishing its first tone before I turned it off. The other side of the bed untouched, the sheets still perfectly aligned the way she had left them, and for a second I stood there looking at that empty space, not with sadness but with a kind of detached awareness, like observing a scene that had already ended. I went through the routine: shower, coffee, the quiet sound of the news playing in the background, even though I was not really listening, because routine has a way of anchoring you when everything else shifts. It gives you structure when emotion tries to pull you in different directions, and I needed that structure now more than ever, not to hold on to what was slipping away but to stay focused on what I was building in its place. Around 8 I checked my phone again, still nothing from Olivia, no follow-up message, no casual update about her arrival, just silence, which told me everything I needed to know, because when someone wants to stay connected they find a way, and when they do not, silence becomes the message. I set the phone down and opened my laptop instead, pulling up the documents I had reviewed the day before, this time not just scanning but finalizing small details, confirming transfers, double-checking access points, making sure every step aligned exactly the way I intended it to. There was no rush, no pressure, just a steady progression, like setting pieces on a board one at a time until the outcome becomes inevitable. By mid-morning I stepped out to run a few errands, things that on the surface looked completely ordinary: a visit to the post office, a stop at a local office building downtown, a short meeting that lasted less than 30 minutes, but carried more weight than anything I had said out loud in days. The man across from me did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not need to. People in his position understand that when someone walks in with clarity, they are not there to debate, they are there to act, and by the time I walked out of that building I knew the framework was complete. Everything else from this point forward was just execution. As I Drove back home. Traffic moved slowly, the kind of steady flow that gives you too much time to think, but my mind did not wander the way it might have before. It stayed fixed on a single realization: this was never about catching her or exposing anything dramatic. There was no need for confrontation, no need for scenes or raised voices, because the real shift had already happened quietly internally the moment I stopped seeing her as someone I needed answers from and started seeing her as someone who had already given them through her actions. People think closure comes from conversations, from final words exchanged across a table, but the truth is closure comes from understanding, and once you understand, you do not need anything else. When I pulled into the driveway again, the house looked the same as it had the day before, calm, unchanged, almost indifferent to everything that was happening inside it. I stepped out, locked the car, and paused for just a second before heading in, not because I was uncertain, but because I could feel the distance now, the separation, not physical but real in a way that does not reverse. Olivia was thousands of miles away, walking through streets filled with lights and music, believing she had stepped into something temporary, something she could leave behind whenever she chose. But here, every quiet decision, every document, every adjustment was turning that temporary distance into something permanent, piece by piece, without noise, without warning, until the version of life she thought she could return to would no longer exist in the way she remembered it. It was late afternoon when my phone finally lit up again, and for a brief second I considered ignoring it, not out of hesitation, but because I already knew what it would be before I even picked it up. Her name on the screen, Olivia, simple, familiar, like nothing had changed. I let it ring once, twice, then answered, not rushing, not delaying, just controlled. On the other end there was noise, not loud, just distant enough to tell me she was outside somewhere. Voices in the background, faint music, the kind of atmosphere that comes with a city that never really pauses. She sounded relaxed, almost light, like the version of herself she had stepped into was still intact. "Hey, you alive over there?" she said, half joking, like the message she sent before had settled everything, like I was supposed to play along and keep things smooth. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my eyes drifting to the window as I listened, not interrupting, not reacting immediately, because sometimes silence reveals more than words ever could. She continued talking, something about the flight being long, the hotel being nice, the weather better than expected, all surface level details delivered in a tone that assumed nothing underneath needed to be addressed. And that was the moment I understood it fully. She did not think this was serious, she thought this was manageable. Something she could frame later, softened with the right explanation, the right timing, the right version of the truth. I let her finish, then answered simply, "Sounds like you are enjoying yourself." My voice steady, even almost neutral, and for a second there was a pause on her end, not long, just enough to register that something was different, not wrong, just not aligned with what she expected. "It is just a trip, Ethan, do not overthink it," she added quickly, like she was closing a door before it could open. Wider, I nodded, even though she could not see me, because that is what people do when they realize the conversation is not about understanding anymore, it is about maintaining control, and she believed she still had it. "I am not overthinking anything," I said calmly, and that was the truth, not because there was nothing to think about, but because I had already done it the night before. The silence that followed carried a different weight, now subtle but present, like the first crack in something she thought was solid. She shifted the topic, asked about work, asked if everything was fine at home, the usual check-in questions that people use to keep things balanced, but I answered them the same way I answered everything else, short, clear, nothing extra, no emotional cues, nothing she could read into, because there was nothing left for her to interpret anymore. After a few more minutes she said she had to go, something about dinner plans, something about not wanting to be late, and I could hear it in her voice that she expected things to remain easy, to stay in that controlled space where nothing had consequences. "I will call you tomorrow," she said, and for the first time in the conversation I allowed a small pause before responding, not to create tension but to let the moment settle exactly where it belonged. "Sure," I replied, and ended the call without waiting for anything else. The line went quiet, and I stood there for a moment looking at my phone, not searching for meaning, not replaying the conversation, just acknowledging what it confirmed. She was still moving through this like it was temporary, like it would end cleanly when she decided it should, but what she did not realize, what she could not see from where she was standing, was that the ending had already started, and it was not waiting for her to come back to begin. The next day passed without urgency, but not without intention. Every hour moved forward with a quiet precision that made everything feel inevitable rather than reactive. I kept my routine intact, answered emails, attended a short meeting around 10:30, and even stopped for lunch at the same place I had gone to for years, the kind of place where the staff recognizes you but does not ask questions, just a nod, a refill of coffee, and space to think, and that space mattered because what I was doing now required clarity, not emotion. By early afternoon I was back at home, sitting at the dining table with my laptop open and my phone placed face down beside it, not because I was avoiding anything but because I no longer needed to check it constantly. Olivia had not called again, and I did not expect her to, not yet. She was still moving through her version of this story, still believing she had time, still assuming that everything back here was paused, waiting for her return. I opened the folder again, the one I had been building quietly over the past few weeks, and reviewed everything one more time, not searching for new information, just confirming that nothing had been missed. Dates lined up, messages aligned, timelines made sense. There was no confusion left, no room for interpretation, just a clear sequence of events that told the truth. Without needing explanation, I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, letting the stillness settle in, because this was the point where preparation ends and action begins. Not dramatic action, not loud or visible, but the kind that shifts everything underneath the surface. I reached over, picked up my phone, and unlocked it, scrolling through my gallery until I found the image I had taken earlier that morning. It was simple, almost ordinary at first glance, a clean shot of the dining table, documents spread out neatly, a pen placed beside them, the kind of arrangement that looks intentional without being aggressive. But what made it different, what gave it weight, was what those documents represented: signatures, dates, official letterhead. Everything finalized, everything real. I looked at it for a few seconds, not hesitating, just acknowledging the moment, because once something like this is sent, it cannot be taken back. Not that I wanted to take it back, that option had already disappeared long before today. I tapped her name and opened the message thread, the last thing she had sent, still sitting there unchanged, like it belonged to a different timeline. Calm down, I will be back in a week. I read it once more, then without adding a single word, without explanation or warning, I selected the photo and pressed send. The message delivered instantly, no typing indicator, no follow-up, just silence again. But this time it was different. This time the silence carried something new, not uncertainty, not distance, but impact, because wherever she was, whatever version of reality she was standing in that moment, was about to shift. I placed the phone back on the table and closed my laptop, slowly, not rushing the movement, just letting it end the way it needed to. Outside, the afternoon light had started to soften, the day moving toward evening like any other, but inside everything had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and for the first time since this began I felt something settle into place, not relief, not satisfaction, just certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself because it already exists. And somewhere across the ocean Olivia was about to see something she had not planned for, something that would not fit into the version of the story she thought she controlled. And when that moment hit, when the image appeared on her screen, there would be no way to smooth it over, no way to delay it, just the undeniable realization that while she was gone everything had already changed. The message was marked as delivered almost instantly, but the response did not come right away, and that was exactly what I expected, because reactions like this do not happen in a straight line. They start with confusion, then hesitation, then realization, and somewhere in between all of that the narrative people build for themselves begins to crack. I left my phone on the table and walked into the living room, not pacing, not waiting, just letting time move the way it needed to, because whatever was happening on her end was no longer something I needed to manage. About 10 minutes passed before the screen lit up again, her name appearing with a call, this time not a message, not casual, not controlled. I looked at it for a second before answering. The background noise was louder now, more chaotic, voices overlapping, music cutting through the line like she had stepped outside in a hurry. "Ethan, what is this?" she said, her voice tight, not panic yet but close, the kind of tension you hear when someone is trying to stay composed while something slips out of their control. I did not respond immediately. I let the silence sit for a moment, just long enough for her to feel it before I spoke. "It is exactly what it looks like," I said calmly, and that was the truth, because there was nothing hidden in that image, nothing exaggerated, nothing misleading, just facts arranged in a way that did not need explanation. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quickly, her tone shifting now, not confused anymore but defensive, like she was trying to reposition herself in a situation she no longer understood. I leaned against the wall, my eyes drifting toward the window again, watching the street outside as if the conversation was happening somewhere else entirely. "I am not doing anything, Olivia," I replied. "I am just not stopping it anymore." There was a pause on the line, longer this time, heavier, and in that silence I could hear the shift happening, the moment where she Realized this was not about a misunderstanding, this was not something she could talk her way around or delay until she got back home, this was already in motion. "You could have talked to me first," she said, her voice lower now, less controlled, less certain, and for a second I almost smiled, not out of amusement but because of how predictable that line was. People always reach for conversation once they realize action has already been taken. "We did talk," I said simply. "Just not in the way you expected." Another silence followed, and this one felt different, not tense, not reactive, just quiet, like she was processing something she had not prepared for, because up until this moment she had believed she was the one deciding how this would unfold. She thought she could leave, explore, return, and then choose how much of the truth to reveal and when, but now that option was gone, replaced by something final, something that did not wait for her timing. "I need to think," she said finally, and the way she said it told me everything. The confidence from the day before, the casual tone, the assumption of control, it was all gone, replaced by uncertainty, the kind that comes when the ground shifts without warning. "You should," I replied evenly, not pushing, not pulling, just leaving the statement where it was. She did not respond right away, and when she did, her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it before, not weak, not broken, just aware. "I will call you later," she said, and this time it did not sound like a plan, it sounded like a question, like she was no longer sure of anything at all. "All right," I said, and ended the call before anything else could be added. The line went silent again, and I stood there for a moment letting it settle, because this was the part no one sees, the moment after the shift, when everything is still technically the same, but nothing feels the same anymore. The photo was never about proving anything, it was about changing the balance, and now that balance had moved completely, and there was no way for it to return to what it was before. She did not call that night, and I did not expect her to. Because once reality shifts, people do not rush back into conversation, they step away, they reassess, they try to rebuild a version of control inside their own mind before facing what changed, and I let that space exist exactly as it was, without interruption, without pressure, without even the quiet urge to check if silence meant distance or preparation. The house settling into a stillness that no longer felt unfamiliar, the same walls, the same furniture, the same quiet hum of appliances in the background. But the weight of it all had changed, not empty, not heavy, just resolved. Like something that had been hanging in the air for too long had finally chosen a side and stayed there, and I moved through the evening the way I had learned to move through everything else. That week, calm, structured, deliberate, each action carrying intention instead of distraction. I made dinner without rushing, ate at the table without turning on the television, without reaching for my phone, without needing noise to fill the gaps, because there were no gaps left to fill, only clarity. And when you reach that kind of clarity, silence stops feeling like something to escape from and starts becoming something you protect. Something necessary, something that lets you hear what is actually real instead of what you are afraid might be. Later that night I stepped outside onto the porch, the air cooler now, carrying that faint edge that comes just before the temperature drops for good, the streetlights stretching long shadows across the pavement, and I stood there longer than I usually would have, not waiting, not thinking, just observing the stillness in a way I had not been able to before. Because for the first time in days my mind was not racing ahead trying to predict outcomes, it was not replaying conversations, it was not questioning possibilities, it had already accepted the direction everything was moving in, and more importantly it understood something else entirely, that I was no longer reacting to it, I was defining it, shaping it in a way that no longer depended on what she chose to do next. My phone stayed inside on the counter untouched. And when I eventually went back in hours later, there were no missed calls, no new messages, nothing waiting to disrupt that stillness, just confirmation that whatever was happening on her side had shifted into something she needed to carry on her own. The next morning came without urgency, no sudden jolt of expectation, no anticipation disguised as routine. I woke up at the same time, followed the same steps, but there was a difference. Not in the actions themselves but in how they felt, lighter, steadier. As if the outcome had already been written somewhere beyond the need to question it. I checked my phone once while pouring coffee and there it was, a single message from Olivia sent sometime in the early hours, short, simple, stripped of everything she used to layer into her words. "We need to talk when I get back." I read it once, not twice, not searching for subtext, just once, and then I set the phone down. Not out of avoidance, not out of anger, but because the meaning behind those words no longer carried weight. Talking was something that should have happened before decisions crossed certain lines, not after those lines had already been erased. I finished my coffee slowly, rinsed the mug, placed it in the sink. The same routine I had followed for years, but this time it marked something different, not repetition but transition. Olivia believed she would return, sit across from me, explain everything in a way that made sense to her, reshape the narrative into something manageable, something that allowed her to maintain a sense of control. But what she did not understand was that there was nothing left to negotiate. The structure she had stepped away from was no longer waiting for her. It had already adjusted, already reformed without her timing, without her influence, without her permission. And I picked up my keys and headed toward the door, pausing for a second, not because of hesitation, but because I recognized the moment for what it was, not dramatic, not loud, not even particularly emotional, just final in a way that did not need to announce itself, the kind of shift that happens quietly and then stays that way, defining everything that comes after without needing acknowledgement. And as I stepped outside, locking the door behind me, walking toward the car with the same steady pace I had carried all week, there was only one thought that remained clear above everything else, not complicated, not layered, just simple and certain. Paris was where she thought she had found her freedom, but this quiet, controlled, unshaken moment, this was where I found mine, and unlike hers, it did not depend on escape, it depended on understanding, and that made all the difference.